Hello, and welcome to Life Diaries, a space where the pages of life open up, one story at a time. These are tales written by experience, spoken from the heart. Take a moment for yourself, and let's begin. In a small room, the walls of which were adorned with faded yellow wallpaper featuring a small floral pattern, sat two people. A short woman with streaks of gray in her hair and sharp features. She had a hooked nose, resembling the beak of a bird of prey, and thin, tightly pressed lips. A massive, rather coarse necklace on her chest trembled every time she opened her mouth, spewing biting, lashing words. "Stanley, is it not clear to you that the old life has become unbearable?" the woman said, sharply lifting her chin. "She is a hindrance." The man looked at his mother, and his gaze mixed defiance and guilt. His soft, yielding features were distorted by pity. His hands hung limply, his gaze wandering, avoiding meeting his mother's eyes. "But she's my wife, Mother. How can you not understand?" The woman threw up her hands and snorted disdainfully. "Oh, don't talk to me about wife. You wouldn't be running around with others if she meant anything to you. And I'm not going to clean up after her. She's a vegetable, and you heard what the doctor said, didn't you? She won't last more than a year. What's the point of doing anything at all? I suppose she'll be perfectly fine in her grandmother's house. She'll remember her homeland and childhood." Stanley shook his head vaguely. "Besides, she'll leave a decent inheritance after her death. That can set our affairs straight." "So?" Stanley looked thoughtfully at his mother and sighed heavily. By the next morning, all the belongings of Grace, Stanley's wife, were packed into travel bags and suitcases. Eleanor, her mother-in-law, with a slight smirk on her face, placed them in the hallway, noticing her daughter-in-law's bewilderment. Grace was a miniature, pretty young woman with light hair, forced to sit in a wheelchair. At 27, she had been suddenly struck by a stroke, turning her into an invalid. Grace had lost not only the ability to move, but also to speak. She was almost constantly in the wheelchair, immersed in silence. Eleanor looked after her daughter-in-law while Stanley was away at work at an insurance company. Sometimes Grace felt that her husband deliberately stayed late at the office, just to avoid returning to his helpless wife, who couldn't even go to the bathroom by herself. It should be noted that Eleanor had never felt much affection for her daughter-in-law. Eleanor disliked Grace's ambitions and drive for achievement. The mother-in-law believed that a girl should be a support to her husband, not spend her days rushing around on the business of the firm where she worked. Grace was an assistant to the general director of a large company. In time, the young woman dreamed of a promotion and a permanent position. Ideally, she aspired to open her own business. However, she had neither the means nor the suitable opportunities yet. The stroke destroyed the last crumbs of Eleanor's sympathy for her daughter-in-law. If before she had merely tormented the girl with nagging, after the incident she constantly yelled at her. She couldn't stand Grace's silent requests and often forgot to give her medicine or lunch. Only one thing pleased her. Grace couldn't speak and didn't interrupt the woman from rereading the plays in which she had once shown on the theater stage. While Stanley struggled to drag the heavy suitcases to the car, Grace sat opposite the door, watching what was happening with silent horror. Her eyes were red, and she could barely hold back tears. "Don't worry," Eleanor smirked. "Your doctor said your heart is weak, you won't last long. And the air in the village is good. Maybe you'll live out this year. A little house in the village. Didn't you ever dream of going back there?" Thousands of thoughts swarmed in Grace's head, but she couldn't express a single one. Her hands lay limply on her lap. If only she could, she would have squeezed the fabric of her sweatpants tightly, and then screamed loudly at her mother-in-law, telling her everything she thought about that old gray witch. "Stan, dear darling, what's taking you so long?" The breathless man climbed the stairs, breathing heavily. It was clear the climb had been difficult for him. He looked at his mother, holding out his hand. The elevator's broken. I had to drag all this from the 20th floor. Eleanor threw up her hands and shook her head, looking reproachfully at her daughter-in-law. And I said we should have hired a mover. Mother, you know perfectly well we don't have the money for that. Once upon a time I went on stage every day, filling halls, and Arthur would come after lectures to watch me, the woman said dreamily. Could I have imagined then that I would have to change diapers? Eleanor looked at her daughter-in-law again and fell silent. Their neighbor, Dorothy, walked past on the landing. Good day, the neighbor nodded. Going somewhere? Eleanor smiled broadly. Dottie, hello? Yes, we're taking Gracie to a nursing home for rehabilitation. The doctor said it should help. It must be very expensive. Dorothy shook her head. Oh yes, very expensive. But we'll have to tighten our belts. The mother-in-law sighed. Can't leave my daughter-in-law without treatment. She's done so much for us. Dorothy said something else and headed into her apartment. The smile and pitiful expression vanished from Eleanor's face. She turned sharply to her son and frowned. Hurry up, before the whole building knows about our plans. I told you we should have done this early this morning. Stanley picked up a suitcase and snorted. Morning? It's freezing cold. It's autumn now. You want me to freeze off all my limbs? The man asked, and without waiting for an answer, left the apartment, leaving his indignant mother behind. Stanley was the only and dearly loved child in the family. Eleanor and Arthur Miller had him late in life and doted on him. The law professor and the dramatic theater star put their careers on the back burner, dedicating themselves to raising their son. The result of such overprotection was a frail Stanley, who at almost 40 lived with his mother and held a low-paying job where his boss humiliated him and his colleagues disliked him. Almost 40 minutes later, Stanley finished carrying all the things and Grace herself. He seated the young woman in the back seat, folding her wheelchair. Tears streamed from her eyes, and she breathed heavily. Her gaze, full of incomprehension and a tiny spark of hope, was fixed on her husband. Gracie, please calm down, the man whispered softly, adjusting the seatbelt. There'll be a neighbor looking after you there. We'll pay her with your money. Naturally, Eleanor interjected. Stanley shrugged and nodded. We're kind of, not doing great financially right now. So yes, it'll be from yours. You'll be better off there. Grace watched her husband with an unblinking gaze, trying to discern in his pale face even a hint of pity or reluctance to commit this act. But there was nothing of the sort, only constant glances around, searching for witnesses. A crying girl and a man carrying her to the car. The car pulled away from Stanley and Grace's house exactly at noon. Eleanor waved and headed home to immerse herself once again in her worn-out book of plays, imagining herself walking onto the stage to the applause of admiring art connoisseurs. Stanley sighed, increasing speed. He tried not to look in the rearview mirror, where he could see the swollen eyes of the girl sitting motionless behind him. Gracie, you understand I have no other choice, right? The man could have sworn the girl raised an eyebrow mockingly. However, after wiping his glasses, he saw only his wife's frozen, stony face. My mother is trying for our own good. She's right. I can't look after you constantly. I have work. She's not young anymore, so you'll be better off there. You'll have your own caretaker. You'll return to your grandmother's house, which you remembered so fondly. So? Stanley fell silent again, turning away from his wife's gaze. But he felt it on his back. It seemed to burn through his thin jacket and imprint itself directly on his lungs, making him breathe faster. The journey to the village where Grace was to live was long. The village was remote and almost abandoned. It had only a few streets with scattered houses, a small shop in the center, and an old medical post, closed several years ago due to lack of staff. The dark blue car stopped with a rattle near a small house with an overgrown garden and a leaning fence. The house itself, at least from the outside, looked quite decent. The garden was full of ancient trees and thick grass, in places rising above the fence. In front of the window stood an old bench on two small stumps, on which someone was lying. While Stanley was taking his wife out of the car, assembling the wheelchair, and unloading the things, Grace watched, unblinking, the silhouette lying near the house of her long-deceased grandmother. The girl squinted but couldn't make out who it was. "Brenda!" Stanley shouted. A short woman with short hair rose from the bench with a grunt. Swaying, she approached the gate. Her face was wrinkled and sagging, her hair tangled. There was a large crack on her lip and an old bruise under her eye. Brenda was dressed in completely mismatched clothes. A yellow t-shirt with some English writing, green short trousers completely unsuitable for autumn weather, and worn pink shoes with rhinestones. "Mr. Stanley Miller!" the woman exclaimed. "You're early," Brenda said with a slurred tongue. Stanley frowned and turned to his wife. "This is your caretaker, Gracie. Meet her. Her name is Brenda. She'll look after you now." In confirmation of her words, Brenda nodded and swayed. If Grace could, she would certainly have rolled her eyes. The situation seemed monstrously ridiculous and terrifyingly awful to her. Stanley unloaded all the suitcases from the car, even carried them into the house, and slipped Brenda a thin envelope. There was clearly not much in it, but judging by her appearance, it was enough for her. Then the man stopped in front of the wheelchair and sighed. "Gracie, why are you so unhappy? I'm sure you're smiling inside. This is your childhood home." The man surveyed the overgrown grounds, the gate that fell apart in his hands, the fresh air, the constant care. What else was needed for happiness? Grace wanted to name a million things that would make her happy. However, as usual, she remained silent, glaring angrily at her husband. Every glance she cast held more thoughts than anyone could express in words. Stanley understood this, and a small worm of conscience even stirred within him. But then his mother's words and the numbers on the bank card surfaced in his mind, and the worm quieted, anticipating the taste of money. Stanley got into the car and waved to his wife through the window. Brenda came closer to her charge, waving to the man. "Don't worry, Mr. Miller. Everything will be fine." The man forced another strained smile, and the car pulled away from the ill-fated house, leaving Grace alone with the empty, overgrown house and a drunk woman who reeked not only of alcohol, but of everything else one could find in the village. A year later. "Stanley, you seriously haven't visited your wife in—" Eleanor glanced at the calendar. "In a whole year?" she said in horror. "Have you gone completely mad, Stanley? And who raised you like this? How do you know? What if she died long ago, or worse, got out of the wheelchair?" Stanley tore his gaze from the television and looked tiredly at the screen, where a match was playing. He had just returned from work and had accidentally mentioned that he hadn't visited his wife once. Eleanor was shocked and indignant. "Brenda calls me every week. Everything's fine there. I take her money every quarter. Calm down." Eleanor snorted, walked over to the sofa where her son was lying, snatched the remote, and turned off the cursed box. "When I'm talking to you, you should only look at me," the woman said loudly and with a touch of drama, shaking her head with its elaborate high hairstyle. "Brenda? Who is that anyway? That same drunk woman you put in charge of looking after your wife? Are you even sure she's taking care of her and not drinking away the money I give her? Maybe she hasn't been to see Grace in ages while you're lying around here watching television?" Stanley felt uneasy. He rolled his eyes, staring at the wall. "You want me to go see her tomorrow? Fine. I'll spend my only day off driving to a remote village to see my half-dead wife. Yes, Mother, you care so much about me." Snorting loudly, Eleanor threw the TV remote at her son and left the room, quietly muttering everything she thought about him. The next morning, Stanley packed a few things, took an envelope with money, and got into the car. He looked longingly at the clock face, which showed only 8 in the morning. The man could still be sleeping, but instead, he had to drive God knows where, and, more importantly, God knows why. He considered his mother's fears groundless. However, he had been used to obeying her in everything since childhood. The journey was long, and as luck would have it, the radio broke. The silence in the car and the rare exclamations of impatient drivers made the morning even worse. Just as he was approaching the village, a large black truck came speeding towards him. It was driving fast, clearly knowing the area. The driver was a man who looked a few years younger than Stanley. He braked sharply at the sight of the slowly moving city car and quietly apologized, saying he didn't mean to. Stanley waved tiredly, not wanting to get into an argument. The way to the house where Grace lived was vaguely remembered by the man. He used to give Brenda the money in the district center, where she would come by bus specifically for the envelope. Stanley had only been to the village itself 3 times. Once when he took his wife there, a second time when he was looking for Brenda, and a third time when he was still dating Grace. And she showed him her childhood home, telling him that first her mother had spent her childhood there, and then she herself. The dark blue car stopped next to an almost new fence. The grass in the garden was mown, but had already grown back significantly, as if it had been done a long time ago, and the area generally looked neglected, as if no one had been there for a long time. Stanley frowned and got out of the car. He carefully opened the gate and called out for his wife, then for Brenda. Silence. No one answered. The man wanted to enter the house, but a huge padlock hung on the door, blocking the way. Stanley tugged at the door, but it didn't budge. He took out his phone and started calling Brenda, but she didn't answer. The man rubbed his forehead tiredly and surveyed the area. Brenda's house should be nearby. He had found her very close to Grace's house. At the time, it seemed like great luck, but now his mother's suspicions didn't seem so foolish after all. Brenda didn't inspire confidence. However, for some reason, Stanley had still trusted her. Leaving the grounds of the little house, the man walked along the street to find Brenda's house. It looked even worse than Grace's house. Stanley entered it, holding his nose. An unpleasant smell hit his nostrils. It was so strong that Stanley only had the strength to quickly look around the house. Brenda wasn't there, and he quickly rushed outside, breathing deeply the fresh air. Catching his breath, he looked up and saw a stout woman with 2 buckets walking by. "Excuse me," he called out and ran towards her. "Excuse me, do you know where Grace is?" The woman frowned. "She lived in that house," Stanley pointed. "And Brenda? Bren, the drunk woman who was looking after the house?" Stanley nodded affirmatively. "Well, then she's probably at Sam's place. He lives at the end of the village. She buys moonshine from him. And who might you be?" "It doesn't matter," Stanley waved her off. "Show me where Sam's house is." "Why not show you?" The woman pointed the way to the local moonshiner's house. Brenda was indeed inside. She was sitting at a huge round table, drinking a yellow liquid that gave off a sharp aroma. Stanley took Brenda by the arms and led her outside. "Where's Grace? Who's so rude?" Brenda asked loudly, her tongue slurring. She seemed to be looking straight ahead but seeing nothing. "My wife, where is she, you drunken sot?" "She lives not far from here." Brenda smirked, raising a disobedient hand. "And what will I get for it?" Stanley angrily pulled out his wallet and took out a few bills, shoving them at Brenda. She counted the money busily and nodded contentedly. Then she slipped out of the man's strong grip and stumbled back into Sam's house. She came out without the money, but with a large bottle of cloudy yellow liquid. "Let's go." The woman waved her hand and hobbled forward, trying not to fall. Stanley followed her. The woman led him beyond the edge of the street. They walked along an empty road for a long time. The man thought Brenda was trying to confuse him, and he was about to yell at her, but in the distance, the roof of an unknown house appeared. The closer Stanley and Brenda got, the more he was struck by the size of the house compared to the other buildings in the village. It seemed simply enormous. 3 floors, a balcony, a huge garden in the backyard. Several cars and agricultural machinery were visible. Brenda stopped near the iron gate of the house and pointed straight ahead. "Here you go, sign for it." She nodded so hard her head almost came off, and walked away without saying anything else. Stanley was shocked by what he saw, so he didn't reply to the woman's remark. He rang the small doorbell. A clear, joyful voice rang out. "Mike, why are you so early?" Stanley was taken aback, freezing in place for a second. "Gracie?" he quietly repeated. The voice on the other side fell silent, and then a deep sigh was heard. "Stan, come in." The door swung open, revealing a huge garden and a stone path lined with many flowers. Stepping carefully along the path, Stanley went inside. Standing on the steps of the house was a short, petite young woman with light hair. She was wearing a beige suit and a shawl. She looked down at her husband. Her face was almost impenetrable, as if a mask was frozen on it. "I thought you weren't going to show up," the girl smirked. "But come in, since you're here." Stanley was speechless. He simply walked slowly behind his wife, who strode confidently through the house. Inside, the house was simply but tastefully furnished. Pleasant colors, beautiful decorations and paintings, soft, clean carpets. One of the doors led to a small study with a computer and a desk piled high with papers. "Oh, don't look in there. We've been in a complete mess with papers lately. Need to sort things out better." Stanley didn't understand anything but turned his gaze to his wife, who looked even better than before the stroke. Her pale face was covered with a healthy blush. Her crimson lips wore gloss, and her eyes were lightly lined. Nothing excessive, but it seemed Stanley had never seen such beauty. Grace led the man into a large room with sofas and armchairs. "I'll make tea now and we'll talk." Grace went to the kitchen, leaving Stanley alone in the room. He sat down in an armchair, unable to tear his eyes away from the beauty of the room, the paintings, the sofas, the flowers, the carpets. It all seemed unreal. The man even pinched himself to make sure it wasn't a dream. He couldn't believe he had expected to see a sick wife in a wheelchair, and instead, a beauty he had never seen before stood before him. Grace returned a couple of minutes later with a large tray on which stood several cups of tea. She handed 1 cup to her husband and took the second for herself, sitting neatly opposite him. "Didn't expect this?" she asked softly. The man shook his head. "I also didn't expect my beloved husband to send me to die for money. I thought—" "Keep your pointless excuses to yourself," Grace requested. "I know everything about you, darling. You're too bad at hiding the truth. It's all about my inheritance. When I received the will from my grandmother in Germany, I was incredibly happy, imagining the life you and I would have now. But then I saw something that made me change my mind." "What?" Stanley stammered. He held the hot cup of tea as if not feeling the pain, and looked straight into his wife's face, hoping to see something there that would help him understand what was happening. "Remember my friend?" Grace asked. "Sarah? We worked together at the firm." Stanley nodded. "She was the one who advised me to change my life a year and a half ago." Tall, stately Sarah sat in an armchair in a small restaurant where their boss had sent them for negotiations that had already concluded. "Dinner's paid for, why not splurge?" Grace smirked, settling comfortably opposite Sarah. Sarah was Grace's colleague. She worked at the same firm, was a few years older, and held the position of department head. She always wore strict suits and had a very definite opinion on many matters, especially concerning finances. Grace opened her small handbag, took out an envelope, and handed it to her friend. "Look, what do you think? Is it real?" Sarah opened the envelope with interest and read the letter. It was a letter from Germany. "Who is Anna Reuter?" "My grandmother," Grace replied. "On my father's side. She married a German when my father was about 6 or 7, and they went to live there. Then Dad returned to Russia and met Mom. The last time I saw Grandma was at Dad's funeral. She offered to take me with her." "And why didn't you agree?" Sarah asked in surprise. "Should I have left Stan? He has his mother here, his job, and I never dreamed of going abroad." Sarah looked at her colleague with incomprehension. "You're incorrigible, Gracie, trading a good life in Germany for a man." Grace rolled her eyes. She knew her friend's opinion of her husband perfectly well and preferred not to listen to it. Sarah was always very sharp in her remarks, which helped her career, but left her with few friends. They all scattered from her bluntness. "Your Stan would be ready to sell his own mother for money. Do you even know how much your grandmother willed you?" "There was a letter attached," Grace replied. "She wrote that I was her last relative, and she was transferring part of the inheritance to her husband's children and part to me. According to the letter, it's a very decent sum, as well as a small share in an estate in Germany." "Do you have to go there to get it?" Sarah asked. "There are instructions on what to do. You can accept the inheritance in Russia. A notary will come here himself." A waiter approached, bringing food. The girls ordered salads and glasses of wine. "I can imagine how happy Stan will be. He always dreamed of money, of his own business." "You dreamed too," Sarah noted, waving her fork. "And unlike him, you have the opportunity to run one." "Don't talk about Stan like that. He's a good person. He's just unlucky." Sarah laughed loudly. "Yes, and his biggest misfortune is his mother. Not a mother-in-law, but I still don't understand why you live with her when you could move out." Grace shrugged. "Eleanor can't live alone. She's not used to it, and it's not that hard for me to tolerate her." Sarah snorted disapprovingly and sipped her wine. "I don't advise you to talk about the inheritance. They'll either send you to the next world for that money, or they'll start fawning over you and take every last penny." Grace slammed her hand on the table and looked threateningly at her friend. "Stan and I love each other. Nothing like that will happen. Don't escalate things. You have too low an opinion of my family. Really." The conversation ended in nothing. That same evening, Grace came home, told her family about the inheritance, and showed them the envelope. The girl had never seen them so happy. That evening, Eleanor opened a bottle of expensive wine, and despite their usual frugality, ordered food delivery for Stanley to celebrate. Grace felt that her life was starting to improve. A few weeks later, Grace was walking down the street, smiling at everything around her. Life at home had improved. Eleanor stopped nagging her. Stanley started coming home earlier from work and spending more time with his wife. Grace was sure that her life had gotten better and would always be this way now. The girl decided to stop near a men's clothing store. She wanted to get her husband a gift and buy a new tie. He was tired of all his old ones. Grace was engrossed in looking at the display window and didn't notice anything around her. Then she turned her head and saw Stanley. She wanted to call out to him, but then she noticed a girl walking towards him. The man hugged her and kissed her. From the unexpected blow to her gut, Grace stumbled and leaned against the display window to keep her balance. She couldn't believe what she saw. Grace didn't make a scene. She simply returned home and went to bed early, thinking about what had happened before falling asleep. The next morning, the girl took a day off from work and went to a local detective agency. A short, thin man in glasses sat at a small table. He was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. Grace sat opposite him and explained the situation. "What exactly do you need?" "Everything," Grace said. "How did they meet? How long have they been seeing each other? Their words, actions, meeting places. I want to know everything." The man whistled but said nothing. He seemed surprised by the girl's eagerness. However, he chose to remain silent so as not to lose a client. For a whole week, Grace was in limbo. She didn't dare tell Sarah the truth, not wanting to hear her say she was right. But she had to admit, Sarah really was right. She seemed to see through Stanley all along, disapproving of their relationship. She had refused to be a witness at the wedding, which had hurt Grace deeply. They soon made up, but the resentment in the girl's soul remained. Only now did she begin to understand her friend, who had only wanted to reach her. A week later, Grace sat alone in a small cafe, drinking her now cold coffee. She was pondering what was happening. Everything in her head just couldn't form a single picture. The girl had always tried for her husband, doing everything he or his mother asked. She had even swallowed her pride, lowering her ambitions. The girl was interrupted from her thoughts by a phone call. The detective asked her to come in. Tossing a bill onto the table, Grace picked up her bag and hurried to the agency. Thankfully, it wasn't far. She rushed inside and sat opposite the man, who, as before, was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. He looked up at his client and adjusted his slipping glasses. "You know, you're lucky your husband's mistress was so talkative." "Really?" Grace asked, not wanting to hear the answer. But the man still nodded. "I had to follow her for almost a week, question her friends, but I found out everything. Her name is Lily Shabanova. She's 22, a graduate of a pedagogical university. They met your husband a few months ago, on the street, I think." "Thank you for the information. What about facts like videos or—" The detective, smiling broadly, reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a huge antique voice recorder. Grace was truly surprised by what she saw. She hadn't seen such devices since childhood. It seemed they weren't produced anymore. After fiddling with something, the man turned on a loud, sometimes crackling recording. "Stan, dear," a clear female voice exclaimed. "Is this for me? Oh gods, how beautiful. Expensive, I bet?" "I don't begrudge you any money," Stanley said in a pleased voice. "Once I open my business, I can spoil you with trinkets every day." "And when—" "Stan, dear," the girl repeated. "You said you don't have money for your business yet?" There were no sounds, but Grace was ready to swear that Stanley smiled broadly. "My wife does. She recently inherited from her grandmother. We'll open a business with her money and live well." "You'll leave her then?" Lily said as if through pouted lips. "As soon as she's no longer useful to me?" "Yes," Stanley said loudly. And the recording continued. The man and the girl said something else. However, Grace was no longer listening. She was lost in her thoughts, sitting with a perfectly straight back and staring straight ahead. She remembered meeting her husband and how happy she was when he proposed. Grace was 11 years younger than Stanley. They met when she was finishing her economics degree. He took her to cozy cafes, walked in the park under the stars, bought tickets to the theater and concerts. Eleanor seemed very sweet and kind back then. Grace, who had recently lost her mother, fell in love with the intellectual family and was ready to marry the not-so-rich and shy Stanley. Sarah was against it, but Grace didn't listen. She was consumed by new feelings. Memories flashed in the girl's mind of choosing Stanley's wedding suit with him, and of sorting through gifts after the ceremony, counting which relatives had given the most. The girl was incredibly happy then. She was sure she would always be that way. Despite the fact that Stanley wasn't at all happy about her dreams of business and a career, he, and more so his mother, wanted a family and children. The girl wasn't ready for that. She wanted more. Now all her dreams and hopes for a life together had crumbled in an instant. Stan, the very Stan who had never raised his voice to his wife, was contemplating how he would use Grace's money to open a business and leave her. It seemed so wild that the girl sat, staring blankly at the wall, for several minutes. The detective didn't interfere. He had seen worse reactions. This was the most normal. Once, a crazy wife had simply smashed his window in a fit of rage at her husband. That had seemed wild then, the ultimate measure of disappointment and anger. But now he looked into the girl's eyes and saw an all-consuming hatred and pain that even gripped him. The man stood up and went to get water for his client. Grace drank the water in one gulp, and then she remembered her friend's words about Stanley being ready to sell his own mother for money. The girl hadn't believed Sarah then, but now it seemed true. A plan began to form in the girl's intelligent mind. A malicious grin appeared on her face, and the detective recoiled. He had never seen such an expression. Several months later, Stanley's dark blue car pulled away from the leaning fence, leaving Grace behind. Brenda was holding her wheelchair. In fact, she was more holding on to the wheelchair than holding it. As soon as the car was out of sight, Grace stood up. Brenda's eyes widened as she stared at her charge, who had simply gotten up from her wheelchair after a stroke. "Brenda, let's make a deal. I'll pay you the same amount my husband pays you, and you won't tell him what you saw." Brenda nodded, dumbfounded, unable to ask questions. She was still holding on to the wheelchair. "Excellent. We'll get along just fine. Here's your first installment." Grace held out several bills. "You'll come every month, and I'll give you money. In turn, you must inform my husband that my condition hasn't changed, and he doesn't need to visit. Is that clear?" The woman nodded, snatched the bill, and without saying goodbye, walked away, while Grace headed into the house to change. Inside the old house, everything was covered in dust. The furniture was draped with cloth, and trash was scattered everywhere. One window was even broken. Children had probably tried to climb in. Grace walked over to the old red sofa, pulled the cloth off it, and sank tiredly onto a chair. A cloud of dust rose around her. The girl took out her phone from her pocket, which Eleanor had miraculously not found, and dialed the only number she could trust. "Come over. Everything happened exactly as you said. Yes, the house in the village. I'm waiting." Tossing the phone aside, Grace lay down. A multitude of thoughts swarmed in her head. She thought about everything and nothing at the same time. An hour and a half later, when Grace had already cleaned the house, changed, and prepared food, the door opened, and a tall girl in a strict blue suit entered. She had a small bag in her hands, wine and takeout food. "Scrambled eggs don't appeal to me," Sarah smirked, nodding towards the old, dirty frying pan, covered with such a thick layer of grease that it was probably impossible to wash off. "Good thing you brought wine. I definitely wouldn't have been able to get through this day without it." Sarah looked around the little house and nodded to herself. Then her gaze fell upon a package of diapers, and she shook her head. "You sat in this. God, it's terribly disgusting." "Yes, I can't disagree. But you know what bothered me more?" Grace asked, taking dishes out of the cupboards. "What?" Sarah was wiping the table and arranging the food containers. "Eleanor changed my diaper only once a day. It was like she didn't notice I went to the bathroom. She was so engrossed in her novels that she didn't hear me getting up and walking around the house." Sarah laughed. "If you'd left the house for a few days, she definitely wouldn't have noticed. The main thing is to put an album with her photos next to her." "Exactly," Grace sighed, sitting down at the table. "I still can't believe they left me to die. and they believed a hastily concocted diagnosis. They heard I didn't have long to live and started rejoicing. How could they possibly question the reality of the diagnosis given by Dr. Peter Jones? Sarah and Grace began to eat, thinking about what they would do next. I'll live here for a month or two until I figure out how to live on. I have zero plans for the future. For the first time in my life, I have no plans. And what are you planning to do here? Sarah asked. An old abandoned house, an overgrown garden, a remote village. You in a place like this are incompatible. If I rush headfirst into something now, I'll definitely fail. I'm not in the right state, Grace explained. You see, I gave up on my dreams of my own business a long time ago. All the groundwork, the ideas, have been gathering dust somewhere in the depths of the apartment for ages. And I think everything's long since become irrelevant. I'll live here, clear my head, maybe I'll come up with something. I haven't had a vacation in a long time. Sarah shrugged. She didn't know what to say to her friend. For the first time, she was also speechless. She didn't like Stanley, not knowing why herself. She had acted foolishly when she refused to be a witness. However, she hadn't thought he was capable of such a thing. She had joked about him being ready to sell his own mother. To her, Stanley seemed like a spineless guy, incapable of anything but processing insurance. But he was able to abandon a person to die. And not just any person, but his wife. It seemed like some kind of madness. Sarah spent the first night with her friend in this house and went home the next morning. Grace quit her job, but Sarah didn't, and she didn't have a rich inheritance from a grandmother. Grace started the new day with a cold shower. Thankfully, her grandmother's house had water and even gas. Her parents had installed all the amenities in the house years ago, but soon after, she died, never truly getting to use them to the fullest. The cold shower managed to refresh her cluttered mind a little, and Grace took a deep breath, feeling the icy drops of water hitting her back. 3 weeks of living in hell were behind her. She had tested her husband. She had hoped to see at least a drop of care or love from him, but in the end, she only received hatred and the anticipation of her speedy death. That was the worst of all. Therefore, Grace couldn't quickly return to her former rhythm. Her accustomed life was over. She needed to shake herself up. She took out the money she had hidden from her suitcase when no one was looking. The girl headed to the shop. She vaguely remembered its location and decided to ask the villagers. Thankfully, it was early morning, and everyone was either going to work or to their gardens. It was autumn, and it was cool outside, especially in the morning, and Grace wrapped herself more snugly in an old coat she found in the cupboard. She managed to find the shop without the help of passers-by. It was exactly the same as it had been 20 years ago. The girl smirked at the sight of the familiar, colorful sign and the cloudy window through which she could see the counters and a stout saleswoman in a blue apron. Stepping inside, Grace inhaled the familiar smell of fresh bread and lemonade, which the saleswoman loved. The woman's name was Martha. When Grace was little, she had just started working here. Now she was probably in charge of the shop. "Aunt Martha, hello. Do you recognize me?" Grace asked. The woman thought for a moment. "Something familiar, but I just can't remember." "I'm Margaret Berlakova's granddaughter. I was here as a child." "Oh, Gracie! How could I not recognize you?" the woman asked, coming out from behind the counter. She hugged Grace, kissing her on the cheek. "You haven't been here in so long, and nothing has changed for us." "I noticed. Will you sell me some groceries?" Grace asked, looking over the counters. They were filled with food, although the shop seemed very small. The girl checked the prices and realized they were even higher here than in the city. "The prices are huge, though." Martha threw up her hands. "Give me a loaf of black and white bread each, a bottle of milk, butter and vegetable oil, a kilo each of pasta, buckwheat, rice and peas, cheese, sugar, salt, and… Oh, Gracie! Go to Mrs. Peterson for dairy. She lives right near you. And this milk. The woman nodded towards the counter. You'd be ashamed to give it to a cat. It has a shelf life of 6 months. Where have you ever seen milk last that long? For vegetables, potatoes, onions, beets, carrots, go to Mr. David Peterson. Everything here is from the local farmer, but it's been sitting around for a while. Almost everyone in the village has their own gardens, and David Peterson always sells cheap. Ask for directions. He's not far from the shop. Martha fell silent. Her words were interrupted by the bell and a man rushing into the shop. He was dressed in dirty clothes. His face was very serious. He pushed Grace away from the counter and said loudly, "Martha, give me 2 bottles of mineral water, and someone was supposed to leave an order here for you. A box of medicines and pest poison. We need to plant before winter soon, and there's nothing to treat with." "Michael, don't you see there's a customer here?" Martha asked sternly. Michael glanced briefly at the girl and waved her off. "She's from the city. If she needs it so much, let her buy it there. I need it urgently." "Michael!" Martha looked at him sternly. Grace raised her hand in a conciliatory gesture. "Let him go, Aunt Martha. He seems to need it more." Martha looked displeased at the man and went to get the box. "Couldn't this have waited just a few minutes?" The man was tall, dark-haired. His hands were calloused, his gaze stern. Grace hadn't seen people like him since childhood. Despite his working, slightly untidy appearance, Michael was quite handsome and a young man. He was clearly over 30, but certainly not more than 40. He looked at the girl, squinting. "Is it that important to you?" the man asked rudely. "I'm not in a hurry, of course, but even in the city, people respect queues, and believe me, they're in a much bigger hurry there than you are." Grace smirked and turned away, feeling the man's piercing brown eyes on her. Martha came out with a heavy box and handed it to the customer. "Take it. The mineral water is over there." She nodded towards the far corner, where mineral water in plastic packaging indeed stood. "You'll pay later, right?" Michael nodded, picked up 2 bottles of mineral water, and left the shop without saying goodbye. "Who was that?" Grace asked Martha. The woman waved her hand and went to the shelf with cereals. "Local farmer. He inherited a small house and livestock from his father about 8 years ago. He decided to start a farm, built everything himself, did it, hired workers, makes ends meet as best he can. He wants to plant the fields, but for now, he only plants large gardens and sells produce to our shop and in neighboring villages. He's not a bad fellow, just a bit rough. No one knows why." Grace collected several bags of groceries and carried them home. They were heavy, and she barely made it, but the small refrigerator at home no longer looked so bare. Then the girl went to get vegetables and dairy products from the people Martha had recommended. Even though the girl was used to buying everything in the city shop, it was cheaper and better to buy from ordinary people in the village. Mr. David Peterson indeed lived not far from the shop. He had a large plot of land and 2 goats that bleated loudly at the sight of Grace. As a child, the girl was afraid of animals, so she avoided them now. Inside the house, Grace found an old man who was crafting a chair. The girl explained the situation and introduced herself. "Gracie, I'm so happy to meet you." The old man smiled through his thick gray beard. "There haven't been young people in the village for so long. You're the first in many years. And Margaret's granddaughter. I only remember her daughter, Natalie." "Yes, that's my mother," the girl nodded. "But so, will you sell me vegetables?" "I can give you some apples for change, too." David Peterson smiled. "Mine are good, ripe, juicy, and they'll keep well for winter. And for compotes, jam, will you take some?" Grace smiled happily. However, Her smile faded when she left the old man's house with 3 huge bags that weighed twice as much as the previous ones. David Peterson had decided to sell her enough produce for a month and a half, apparently thinking the girl would eat only potatoes and beets. Grace was uncomfortable refusing, so she sacrificed her back, which definitely couldn't handle the load. After walking only a few steps, Grace stopped, heavily setting the bags on the ground. A black car with a large bed stopped near her. "Need help?" Hearing a familiar voice, Grace looked up and saw Michael, looking at the girl's bags. Remembering the man's words in the shop, the girl thought. She didn't want to ride with a man who didn't know how to be polite, but she also didn't want to drag the huge bags. So she had to swallow her pride again. "Yes, that would be helpful." Michael got out of the car and picked up the bags. "You really stocked up. Are you planning to stay here for the winter?" "No, I'm going to make compote and fry potatoes." The girl smirked and picked up a smaller bag, helping to load it into the truck bed. Michael turned around and took the bag from the girl's hands. Grace felt his warm touch and froze for a second. Then she let go of the rough fabric and took a few steps back. Michael put down the bag and closed the truck bed. "Show me the way where to take you." "Of course I'll show you," Grace said, getting into the passenger seat. "Such a lady from the city coming to us?" "Well, yes," Grace said thoughtfully. "And what attracted you here?" "I grew up here," Grace shrugged. "And I had some problems at home, and I needed somewhere to be alone. I remembered this little house. I always loved this village. It's quiet and peaceful. Nothing interferes with thinking." "Yes, that's true." Michael drove fast. Either he was in a hurry, or it was his personal driving style. However, he wasn't slow anywhere else either, in the shop or on the street, so Grace decided it was just his characteristic trait. The bags were unloaded and even carried into the house. Michael walked through the grass that reached his waist. It had already started to dry, so it rustled loudly underfoot. "Is there really no one to mow?" Grandma did it herself almost until she died. She could do literally everything, from cutting and sewing to mowing and fixing the roof. And I'm just a city girl who can't do anything with her hands. "Almost none of the women in our village know how to mow, not even with an electric trimmer. Equality hasn't reached here." Michael smirked. "You're from the city, right?" Yes, the man replied and looked at his watch. "Look at the time. I should be going." "And what's your name?" "Grace," the girl introduced herself. "Beautiful name. Nice to meet you, Grace." "You too, Michael," the girl smiled. Michael left, leaving the girl alone. Grace watched the departing car for a long time, trying to understand the man's motives. The next morning began with a clatter and a strange rustling sound. Grace, tossing and turning, got up from the creaky bed and went to the window. Outside, in the middle of the overgrown grass, stood Michael with an old scythe. The grass lay in neat rows under Michael's movements. It was clear he was sweating, despite the cool morning weather. Grace threw open the window and called out to the man. Michael looked back, stopping his mowing. He was breathing deeply, looking at the open window and the girl looking at him. Grace was wearing only a long linen dress she had found in the cupboard and decided to use as a nightgown. After cleaning the house and cooking, the girl was quite tired. She had no time left to unpack, so she put on what she found in her grandmother's cupboard. "What are you doing?" Michael raised his eyebrows, silently expressing his opinion of the foolish question. "I understand you're mowing, but why are you doing it at my house?" "Do you want me to stop?" Michael asked, looking at the girl with a slight smirk. Grace shook her head and closed the window, not wanting to continue the conversation. Besides, she had noticed the man's gaze. He was clearly looking her over. To avoid such situations repeating, the girl changed clothes and went to the small kitchen. Grace decided to make pancakes. Of course, she had never woken up so early and didn't want to cook anything. Furthermore, the fast city pace had taught her not to eat breakfast, but she had to feed the unexpected helper who had decided to come to her house early in the morning and work. When Michael finished, which was clear from the cessation of the scythe's sound, the pancakes were already ready. Grace was just finishing the last one. The girl went out onto the porch and called out to the helper, "Come in and have breakfast." The man shrugged, put down the scythe, and entered the house. He was all sweaty and tired. "You can use the shower." Grace nodded towards the bathroom and went into the kitchen. Michael didn't take up the hostess's offer. He only washed his face. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. A plate of pancakes and sour cream was before him. Grace stood near the table, her arms crossed. "How much do I owe you?" Michael raised his eyebrows in a question mark. "Well, you didn't do it for free, did you?" "For the food." The man smirked and took a bite of a pancake. Leaning back in his chair, he looked directly into the girl's eyes, as if wanting to read something in them. "Well, if you don't want to accept payment, I won't insist," Grace shrugged. "I'm used to any work being paid for." "And haven't you heard of help in the city?" Grace snorted and laughed. "You said yourself you're from the city. Aunt Martha told me you've lived here for 8 years, which means you can't reproach me." "I'm not reproaching you. City people are just always surprised when they're helped for free. I used to be like that too." "And why aren't you eating, by the way?" Michael asked, tilting his head. He was looking at the girl with interest. "I don't eat breakfast." The girl waved him off. "I always had to go to work early. I'm not used to it. I usually snacked at work." "And what did you do for work?" Michael asked, tilting his head. "Assistant to the general director of a firm." Michael whistled and smiled. "It's surprising that after that, you ended up here." He gestured around the small house with faded wallpaper. "Don't think I was raking in money with a shovel, only with a child's sand shovel. A very child's one. But I liked it. I was learning business management, and I had a dream. Then I had a stroke." The girl chuckled. "But I'll tell you that story some other time. I still need to clean the house and the attic today. Besides, a friend promised to come in the evening. A busy life, you know." Michael smiled back at her words. "Well, I should be going too." Michael finished his breakfast and left Grace's house. She watched him leave with a long gaze again, trying to understand his motives. That evening, Sarah arrived. She brought some things Grace had asked for. Sarah whistled when she saw the mowed and tidy yard. She put down her bags and called out to her friend, who was wiping the cloudy windows at that moment. "I need to replace a pane of glass. Where do you think I can find a handyman?" she asked without greeting her. Sarah smirked. "Ask the person who mowed your entire yard." "That was Michael, the local farmer. He gave me a ride yesterday. I don't think he has time for glass." Grace waved her off. "Well, he found time for the grass," Sarah shrugged. Grace stopped rubbing the glass. She invited her friend into the house. "If you don't mind, peel the potatoes. They're under the sink. I can't do anything anymore. I'm tired." Grace sank into a chair and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Sarah took off her jacket and picked up a knife. "So, what's going on with the farmer?" I didn't know him before. He came here 8 years ago. My grandmother died around that time. He runs a farm, he has various animals, gardens. What else is there to say about him?" "Is he rich?" "Sally!" the girl reproached. "What?" Sarah protested. "It's very important nowadays." "Well, okay, how do you feel about him as a man?" Grace thought for a moment. "I don't know. He's kind of ambiguous. First, he was rude to me in the shop, and then he decided giving me a ride was a good idea. And he even came to mow the grass in the morning, even though I didn't ask. and then he refused to take money. Maybe he likes you? Don't be silly, Grace waved her off. He thinks I'm a city fool, from what I understand. Take a closer look at him. Maybe for once in your life, you'll have a normal man who knows what it means to be a man. Grace rolled her eyes but said nothing to that. How's work? Oh, don't ask. Without you, our boss has gone completely crazy. He's already changed his assistant 3 times. He can't do anything. It turns out you did more than we all thought. Grace had been living in the village for a month. She had gotten used to the small house and the quiet life, and she had also gotten used to resting, which terribly annoyed her. The girl had worked all her life. She grew up in a not-so-rich family and started working right after graduation. She didn't take days off without a special reason and always came to work on time. And now she had done almost nothing for a month. Yes, Grace spent the first week on the house, trying to bring it into a habitable state, scrubbing everything clean. But then silence and calm set in. The girl woke up late, read books Sarah brought her, visited the old women, and listened to their stories from their youth. Furthermore, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she kept running into Michael. On the day Sarah visited, he overheard the conversation about the glass and came to replace it the next morning. Grace fed him fritters. Then he fixed the gate, and the girl prepared breakfast for him again. This happened several more times, and it became a habit. Grace was no longer surprised by the early clatter outside and the presence of the man under her window, and Michael, as usual, came into the house and sat down at the table. There were almost no long and meaningful conversations between them. He didn't give her flowers, didn't pay her compliments. He was simply there. He was nearby. It seemed very strange. Grace desperately wanted to understand his motives. Admit it, Michael. You just come here to eat? I didn't say that, the man smirked, tearing himself away from the dripping faucet. Most of their conversations were like this, short, insubstantial, and usually joking. Rumors circulated in the village, and some girl from the farm even came to Grace, threatening her. Michael is mine, got it? The voluptuous brunette said menacingly. You think you came here from your city and can snatch up our men? Well, tough luck. The stranger angrily tore a leaf from a tree and threw it at the startled Grace, who was standing on the porch. When Michael came the next time, she told him about her admirer. Were you scared? The man smirked, but there seemed to be a hint of seriousness in his words. I haven't been scared of village women yet. I've been threatened by big grown men when I worked at a large firm. Once, instead of my boss, I refused to sign a contract with a firm, and they almost beat me right there. 5 grown men in suits, and I was alone. That's scary. Not a leaf thrown by some crazy admirer of a man who, for some reason unknown to me, fixes everything that breaks in my house. Michael smiled and fell silent. You're not very talkative, are you? The man nodded. Maybe we should use you and I instead of formal address? There doesn't seem to be that big a age difference between us. Michael agreed to the girl's suggestion and returned to his borscht. Grace smirked. It was the first time she had seen a man who didn't want to talk. One day, Grace was walking around the village. Michael hadn't visited her in a while, and she assumed he had gotten tired of it. She went for a walk to clear her head. And somewhere deep down, she hoped she would meet Michael on the way. For some reason, she really wanted to see him again. She had become so used to his strange silence that she almost missed it. The only thing the girl encountered in the village was men running back and forth. They were talking about something. Grace approached Martha, who had come out of the shop and was looking worriedly somewhere in the distance. Aunt Martha, what happened? The woman put her hand to her face. Well, Michael's farm is falling apart. Something's wrong there. Some problems. Our men and women are completely distraught. They might lose their jobs. And where else can you find work in our village? Oh, what a disaster. Michael always just barely stayed afloat, scraped by as best he could, but now something's gone completely wrong. Grace frowned and looked into the distance. Could you tell me the way to Michael's farm? Martha explained how to get to Michael, to his workplace. His farm was at the very end of the village. It was a large, long building from which the lowing of cows could be heard. Here and there, women in aprons walked around, carrying buckets. There were men in the backyard. Behind the farm were large gardens. Now, in mid-autumn, they were empty. Grace asked a woman passing by where Michael's office was and headed there. The man's office was small, even tiny. In the middle stood a desk and a chair. In the corner, a cupboard and a small window in the wall through which crumbs of light filtered in. Michael himself stood in the middle of the office, bent over papers. He was saying something with just his lips, counting on a calculator and making corrections to documents. Grace approached him. "Michael, hello." The man turned sharply and sighed. "Something else is broken?" he asked. "Sorry, now is not the best time." "No," Grace replied. "I heard you have problems. I came to help." "Something with documents? It's fine. I'll manage," the man said a little roughly, and she stepped closer and almost pushed Michael aside, taking hold of the papers. The man exhaled loudly. "Go away, or I'll have to physically remove you." Grace raised her hand and looked closer. She had only glanced at the papers, but she already saw huge sums and exorbitant expenses that were simply unnecessary for this small place, compared to the city. "Do you even have an accountant or a financial specialist?" "I can manage everything myself," Michael repeated. "I see how you're managing. Outrageous expenses for nothing. You urgently need a specialist." "And where am I supposed to get one?" Michael asked grimly. Grace smiled broadly and pointed to herself. "I have a degree in economics. Besides, I worked for several years at a firm where the expenses and income were clearly much larger than yours." Michael waved his hand and sat down tiredly on the chair, leaving Grace with the papers. Late in the evening, when it was already dark, Michael and Grace left his office. The farm was empty. The workers had put everything away and locked up. "Are you sure that if you cut these expenses, nothing will change? Why do you need both cold storage and milk delivery 3 times a day? One is enough, it'll be taken away, and the rest of the time it will be stored in the refrigerator. There's no point in driving cars and spending a huge amount of money on that. And it's the same with many expenses. The estimates are very poorly drawn up." Michael scratched the back of his head in confusion. "I was a soldier, actually. I'm a long way from estimates and accounting. My father always dreamed of having his own big farm and fields, but I decided to fulfill his dream, even if it's late." "Late? He died?" "Thank God, no. He got seriously ill. I had to put him in a special facility. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have been able to handle him. So I had to raise the farm from its knees." Grace looked sympathetically at Michael, walking along the narrow path. It was cool outside, the wind was blowing, but at the same time it felt like things couldn't be better. So calm and quiet. "So, what's the story with the stroke?" Michael asked unexpectedly. Grace flinched. At first, she wanted to make a joke, but then she remembered she had promised to tell him. Exhaling loudly, she began her story. "That's when I came up with that plan." She recalled the conversation with the detective. "Sarah and I helped put it into action. She found a doctor who, for a small fee, agreed to say I'd had a stroke and would die soon. They believed it quickly, as if without thinking, as if they were expecting it. It was terrible. The 3 weeks I lived with my husband and mother-in-law completely killed any pity or sympathy I had for him. I became forgotten and unwanted. And when he brought me here, I knew it was the end. Michael took the girl's hand and squeezed it tightly. Grace looked at the hand the man was holding and nodded in thanks for the support. Why don't you go back to the city? At first, I just wanted to calm down and wait a bit, but then I realized I didn't want to go back there. It's such a fast pace, constant rushing around. Plus, another reminder of Stan and his mother. Michael released the girl's hand and sped up. Come on, I'll show you something. They walked for a long time. Grace didn't know where. However, when they arrived, she gasped in surprise. The man had led her to a huge, luxurious house with a high fence. This is a friend's house. We served together. He recently died of cancer. Now the house is for sale, and I don't want that. I wish I could buy it, but I don't have the money, as you know. They're going to buy the house to tear it down and build something like a sawmill here, or I don't even know. You understand that if you buy this house, there'll be no turning back? I don't want to go back to the city. For the village, I'm too fast, too impatient. For the city, I'm too slow. It's a paradox. Here I can achieve something, but not there. Grace fixed her gaze on the man's stern face, on his eyes that looked at the house with hope, on his tightly pressed lips, and on the wrinkles on his forehead that appeared when Michael was thinking about something serious. A determined spark lit up in Grace's eyes. She squeezed Michael's hand, just as he had done hers a few minutes earlier, and smiled. You'll definitely succeed, I'll help. We'll raise the farm, and you'll be just as your father dreamed. I promise. Michael didn't reply again, but the hope that flickered in his eyes made her happy. He believed in the best. Michael and Grace began working together. She helped him raise the farm, create new working conditions. They bought new livestock and equipment. Profits began to appear not just on paper. The man was very happy about this. He gave the girl flowers several times as a sign of gratitude, and the tradition of fixing Grace's house also returned. He came almost every morning, and she prepared breakfast. It was their ritual. A few weeks after the walk, Sarah came to visit the girl and brought documents. Are you sure? She asked her friend. More than, Grace replied and took the folder. There's no turning back, Sarah repeated Grace's own words. I know, and I'm willing to take the risk. Sarah remained silent, not wanting to argue with her friend. After what had happened, she tried to support her in all her endeavors. Grace pressed the documents to her chest and headed towards the farm. New equipment was supposed to arrive today, so the girl hurried as fast as she could. Besides, she had some happy news. Grace found Michael as usual in his office. He was sitting at his desk, writing something. At the sight of the girl, he smiled and brightened up. You're early, he said, pulling out a chair for Grace. The girl sat down at the desk and placed the papers on it. Read this. Michael took the folder and began to slowly turn the pages. With each page, his eyes grew wider and wider. The girl watched his reaction with hidden fear and anticipation. Closing the folder, Michael placed it on the desk and lowered his eyes to the girl. What have you done? He asked hoarsely. Have you bought the house? Grace nodded and rose tiredly from the chair. She stood directly opposite the man, tilting her head up and looking straight into his eyes. You didn't want it torn down. It was your friend's house, and I promised you would succeed. That's a lot of money, Michael exhaled. It's my money. I do whatever I want with it. Besides, I like the village and... Grace's stream of thoughts was interrupted by a kiss. Is this how you decided to get the house? Grace smirked when Michael pulled away. Is that what you think of me? He asked hoarsely. No, the girl breathed out. I bought this house for us if you want us to be together. I think I'm in love. The man kissed the girl again. "Me too," he replied, gently hugging Grace. The present. Stanley sat opposite his wife and couldn't believe her story. His hands lay limply on his lap, and his eyes stared straight ahead. He wasn't trying to see anything. He simply couldn't turn his head from surprise. "Are you saying you made all this up to test me?" Grace looked at him sadly and sipped her tea. There was a knock at the door. Sarah entered wearing a tight blue dress. She looked directly at Stanley and smirked. "Well, did you tell him everything? Too bad I couldn't see his face. I'm a little late." "So you knew everything?" Stanley roared. Sarah smirked. "He was my doctor, whom I paid for the diagnosis. Did you really think Gracie pulled all this off alone? She loved you too much to do that. But you broke her heart, decided you could treat her like garbage." Stanley pursed his lips. "You don't know anything! Gracie, I love you! Gracie!" Grace raised her eyebrows and smirked. "And Lily? Doesn't she suit you anymore? Or couldn't she wait until you opened your business and showered her with gifts?" Stanley opened his mouth to object but fell silent at the last moment, realizing that excuses were pointless. "But how dare you play such a trick on Mother and me?" Stanley asked. "She was so upset when she found out you were sick." Sarah and Grace exchanged glances and laughed. "Eleanor was running ahead of everyone, shouting with joy that her daughter-in-law was sick and would kick the bucket soon. She was waiting for my inheritance more than you were." Stanley looked around the house, then smiled broadly. "You bought and earned all this while married to me?" Sarah frowned, understanding what her friend's husband was getting at. She wanted to object, but he opened his mouth again. "And since you acquired this while married to me, half of the property is mine, right?" Sarah was a lawyer. She knew the law perfectly well and how such situations ended. Grace stood up from the armchair and glared angrily at her husband, wanting to tell him everything she thought about him. But at that moment, the door opened, and the same man from the truck that had cut off Stanley entered. "Hi, Mike!" Sarah nodded and whispered something in the man's ear. He turned to Stanley with a very serious, enraged face. It seemed almost impossible to stop him. He advanced on the man. Stanley swallowed in fear and began to back away. "Find your way out! If you, idiot, dare to threaten Grace, I'll make your life hell," Michael said roughly, grabbed Stanley by the scruff of the neck, and threw him out of the room. Sarah, Grace, and Michael heard the front door slam. Stanley walked away from the house quickly. "Why did you let him in?" Michael asked Grace, coming closer and hugging her from behind. In front of her husband, she had held back, not wanting to show weakness. But everyone in that room knew how difficult it was for her to endure her husband's betrayal. The girl stood with her head lowered, holding back the urge to cry. "I had to tell him everything," the girl said. "I needed to see his face when he realized that my inheritance wasn't coming to him." "Did that make you feel better?" Sarah asked. Grace nodded and wrapped herself more tightly in Michael's strong and reliable embrace. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow." Despite Michael's threats, Stanley decided to file a lawsuit for divorce and division of property. From a legal standpoint, he was correct. If he had wanted to claim the inheritance, he would have been wrong. But the girl had bought the house and leased the fields, the income from which is considered jointly acquired property. The court summons arrived by mail. Michael brought it with the other documents and handed it to the girl grimly. When Grace opened the envelope and read the summons, she paled instantly and sank tiredly onto the sofa. She was all dirty and dusty, having just come from the fields, but she didn't care. She hadn't thought Stanley would actually sue for property division. However, she had also thought he wouldn't abandon her to die. He turned out to be a very unpredictable person. "We need a good lawyer," Michael said, picking up the summons. Sarah, Grace said. She heads the legal department at the firm. She has a license to handle cases. I think she can help us. Besides, we don't need to tell her our whole story. Michael sat down next to the girl. Listen, I looked in the bathroom after you yesterday, and… Grace looked at the man in fright. I don't know what to say, and I found a test there. Are you pregnant? Grace nodded. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd be against it, and… A soft kiss interrupted the girl. She hugged the man and smiled broadly. So you're not against it? His joyful smile and mischievous eyes gave a better answer than any words. He hugged the girl tightly and pulled her close. If that scoundrel suddenly decides to sue you for half the property, I don't care. You and I won't be left with nothing. We'll have our house, the fields, our child, and each other. We'll have each other. Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath. But when she opened them, Michael saw the look that had once frightened the detective. It was a determined and unwavering gaze. He went to court to take what belongs to me by blood, but he'll leave there with nothing. I'll take not only what's mine, but everything he has. He'll be left with nothing. The court hearing took place very soon, as if the universe itself wanted to finish with this strange case as quickly as possible. Sarah became Grace's lawyer. Michael supported the girl from the witness bench, as did many villagers. The judge was a tall, red-haired woman with a stern gaze. She listened to the plaintiff Stanley's statement with boredom, asking him clarifying questions that he couldn't always answer. It seemed to amuse her. Witnesses for the plaintiff included Eleanor, neighbors, and Stanley's friends. They all spoke only ill of the girl. Eleanor, in particular, ranted as if for the last time, using all her dramatic flair. I was so scared when Gracie, and when she had the stroke, I didn't sleep for 3 nights, waiting for news from the hospital. Tears streamed from the woman's eyes. She wiped them with a white handkerchief and continued. And when I saw Gracie, I almost had a heart attack myself. She wasn't moving, she was almost lifeless. I had to take care of her while Stan Deer was working. I cleaned up after her, fed her, and she wasn't sick after all. The worst thing I could ever experience has already happened to me. My son and I have been betrayed, deceived, and now they want to leave us with nothing. Eleanor cried once more and sat back down on the bench. The judge, after her speech, seemed to get more invested in the case and listened to the other witnesses with interest. Your Honor, the statements of the plaintiff and his witnesses should not be believed. To begin with, the defendant has evidence of the plaintiff's infidelity. The recording has been submitted as evidence. The recording of Lily and Stanley's conversation boomed throughout the courtroom. Then the detective testified as a witness, describing the plaintiff's relationships. Lies! Eleanor jumped up from the bench. But after a warning from the judge, she sat back down. She seemed deeply distressed by the slander. Furthermore, I would like to note that the defendant did not deceive the plaintiff with documents. She merely pretended to be sick to test him. No medical certificates were provided. The doctor only verbally gave the diagnosis of the patient to the plaintiff and his mother. And the plaintiff's side claims to have taken care of the sick defendant. Sarah continued. However, I have a recording of a conversation between Ms. Eleanor Miller and her son. I request it be played. Yes, Stan Deer, feed her. Oh, I got carried away reading. I completely forgot. But it's fine. She can wait until lunch. She won't lose any weight. How are you doing? Did you find a caretaker for her? Good. The main thing is she charges little, and the fact that she drinks is not a big deal. The doctor said anyway that she won't last long. The conversation ended, and the courtroom gasped in surprise. Sarah continued. Furthermore, the plaintiff has filed a request for the division of the following property: a residential house at the address Ilinskaya Village, Rapina Street, House 8, as well as income from the fields of the firm Golden Birch, which were indeed purchased by Ms. Grace Miller, the defendant. But this property was transferred to the full ownership of Mr. Michael Smith a week before the lawsuit was filed. Therefore, the property was acquired during the marriage and transferred also during the marriage. Thus, the plaintiff cannot demand its division. The remaining money in the defendant's personal account and the share in the estate in Germany are part of the inheritance, which the plaintiff also has no right to claim. The judge smirked. She did it almost imperceptibly, but Grace was ready to swear that she looked at Stanley with a hint of satisfaction. To transfer the property to Michael's ownership, they had to try hard and find a corrupt notary who concluded the deal retroactively. This greatly helped the case. Well then, in this way, the lawsuit is considered invalid? The judge asked Sarah. The lawsuit filed by Mr. Stanley Miller is aimed at the equal division of property between the former spouses. But this includes not only the defendant's property, but also the plaintiff's own property, namely, a 3-room apartment at the address Pegasova Street, House 24, 3rd entrance, Apartment 33, a BMW car, as well as money in the joint account of the plaintiff and defendant. Objection! Stanley's lawyer, a stout old man with a bald head and round glasses, jumped up. The apartment is the plaintiff's inheritance from his father, correct? Correct, Sarah nodded. But according to the law, if one spouse has made significant improvements to the property of the other spouse, it can be recognized as joint property. And what significant improvements were made? The lawyer asked. Now on the screen, Your Honor, you will see photographs of the apartment before its renovation. As you can see, it was in decent condition. This was exactly 1 year after the wedding. And here are photographs of the apartment after the renovation, 6 months later. How will you prove that this was done with the defendant's money? Firstly, in the period from September to April, when the renovation took place, the plaintiff was not working, and according to the bank statement, he did not have the necessary amount of money in his personal account. Furthermore, the testimony of the foreman of the renovation team has been submitted as evidence. The contract was concluded in the defendant's name. The lawyers argued for a long time, called witnesses, and tried to prove their point of view. But soon the judge withdrew to deliver the verdict. She returned with a large red folder. "All rise, court is in session," the judge's assistant said. The court rendered a decision to grant the plaintiff's claim. The property of Mr. Stanley Miller will be divided between him and his wife. 1/3 of the apartment goes to the defendant, the car becomes jointly owned, and 50% of the money from the plaintiff's account becomes the property of Ms. Grace Miller. The court's decision is final and not subject to appeal. The sound of the gavel settled everything. Stanley and Eleanor looked at Grace, who was being hugged by Michael, with malice and hatred. Sarah, smiling broadly, joined them. "I told you we'd take everything from him," the girl said in a slightly strange, even obsessive voice. "It's rightfully yours, not his," Michael breathed out. "Understand? Now you and I have everything we dreamed of." The man smiled. "All that's left is to have a child, and the house will be full," Sarah said, gathering her papers. "Well?" Grace prompted and looked at her stomach. Sarah smiled. "Fast work, certainly. Will you make me godmother?" "Do we have a choice?" Michael asked. "None at all." Grace smiled and hugged the 2 most precious people in her life again. Now everything would definitely be all right for her.